We all like to think we're in the driver's seat of our own lives, right? That our choices are ours. But what if that feeling of control is partly an illusion? That's what we're going to dig into today.
So think about it for a second. And I don't mean deciding between coffee or tea. I mean a big decision, a belief you hold. Can you say with 100% certainty that it came entirely from you with no outside influence? We're going to challenge that very idea, that we're always in complete command.
Most of the time, we just operate on this default setting. We assume our thoughts are original, that our choices spring up from within, and that every decision starts and ends with us. It's just how we experience the world.
But what if that feeling is just a last step in a much longer process? The truth is, real influence doesn't happen by trying to force your hand. It works by setting the stage, by shaping the environment long before you even realize a choice needs to be made.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this, we need to draw a very clear line in the sand between two words that we often throw around as if they're the same thing. They're not.
And this really breaks it down, doesn't it? Persuasion is a conversation. It's visible, it's direct, you know someone is making their case, and you have the power to say, yeah, okay, or nope, not for me. Manipulation, though, that's a whole different game. It's invisible, it's indirect. It works behind the scenes to frame your reality so that when you finally make a choice, you're convinced it was your idea all along.
Let's pull this out of the theoretical and into a place you've probably been to this week, a place where this is happening all around you.
Think about a grocery store. It feels like total freedom, right? You can go anywhere, buy anything, but that whole space is a meticulously designed system. The path you walk is intentional. The most expensive brands, they're right there at eye level for a reason. Even the lights and the colors are all designed to subtly guide your attention. It's so effective because you're not meant to notice it at all.
Now take that exact same principle of a designed environment and apply it to the world inside your phone. Your social feed isn't just a random stream of information. It's a carefully filtered reality. Certain ideas get amplified, shown to you again and again until they feel normal. Other ideas, they just disappear. And over time, without you even realizing it, this slow, steady filtering literally shapes what you think is important, what's normal, and even what's true.
So why does this work so well on us, on all of us? It has nothing to do with being smart or naive. It has everything to do with the fact that our brains are built for one thing above all else: efficiency.
Look, our brains just don't have the energy to analyze every single piece of data we encounter every day. Can you imagine how exhausting that would be? So, to cope, they create these little mental shortcuts. They look for patterns, they make assumptions. It's what lets us get through the day. But those very same shortcuts, well, they can be guided.
Let's look at a big one: repetition. When your brain hears something over and over and over again, it starts to feel familiar. And your brain mistakes that feeling of familiarity for a feeling of truth. It's not a logical conclusion, it's a gut feeling. Familiar feels safe. Familiar feels right.
And here's another huge shortcut: consensus. If it seems like everyone around you believes something, your brain's natural instinct is to think, well, it must be true then. It's not because you've checked the facts yourself, it's because we're wired to find safety in the herd. Social agreement feels like validation. And this one is a powerhouse: emotion. The moment a strong emotion hits you, fear, anger, excitement, your thinking literally narrows. It's like you get tunnel vision. Your ability to be critical and ask questions just switches off, and you become much more likely to accept whatever information triggered that feeling in the first place.
So, and this is the most important part, this isn't a story about our weaknesses. This is a story about being human. These shortcuts, these vulnerabilities, they're just part of the standard operating system for our brains.
This quote really says it all. We are all influenced. That's the constant. It's happening to everyone all the time. The only variable, the only thing that gives you some of your power back is awareness. Just knowing these systems are at play is the first giant step. And building awareness isn't a passive thing. It's an active skill. It's about starting to really notice the information you're taking in. It's about asking a simple, powerful question: why am I seeing this right now? It's about taking a breath, a pause, before you have that knee-jerk emotional reaction. And it's about watching your own mind as it jumps to conclusions.
So we'll end with this. Realizing that you're not in 100% control isn't scary. It's empowering, because it lets you ask the most important question there is. If my choices aren't entirely my own, what and who is shaping the rest?
Have you ever stopped and wondered what's really happening inside your head when you make a choice? We all like to think we're in the driver's seat, that we're in control. But today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden and honestly pretty surprising process behind every single decision you make. So, first things first, let's talk about a story. It's a story we all tell ourselves about how our decisions are made. And the wild part is, it feels completely 100% real. You know the one I'm talking about. It's this fundamental belief we all share. When you're faced with a choice, you assume a conscious, thoughtful process just kind of kicks in right before you act. And this process, it seems so logical, right? We tell ourselves this story, okay, first I pause, then I analyze the details, then I evaluate the options, and then I choose. It's a nice, clean, rational little model. And this right here is the key. It feels this way. When you think back on a decision, it really feels like you were the one in charge, calm, collected, and totally in control of the outcome. But what if I told you that this feeling, this sense of rational control, is mostly just an illusion? That for the vast majority of your choices, something else is going on entirely under the hood. To really understand what's happening, we need to meet the secret decision maker, the one that's running the show most of the time. Let's call it your brain's autopilot. Just think about the sheer volume for a second. Your brain isn't just making big decisions like picking a new job or what to have for dinner. No, it's making thousands of little micro decisions every single day, all the time. These are the tiny decisions that shape your reality from one moment to the next. You know, the car you suddenly notice in traffic, the comment you automatically tune out in a meeting, that gut feeling that tells you a dark alley is a bad idea, or the headline that just seems to jump off the page. It's constant. And get this, almost all of this activity is happening completely beneath the surface of your conscious awareness. It's this silent, powerful force just guiding your entire experience of the world. So how in the world does the brain manage all of this? Well, neuroscientists often talk about a model with two very distinct systems operating in your mind. Let's break them down. On one side, you have the slow system. This is your conscious, analytical mind. It's the part you fire up to solve a tricky math problem or plan a detailed vacation. And then you have the fast system. This is your gut instinct, your automatic pilot. It's reactive and incredibly efficient. But here's the catch. The slow system is expensive. It's hard work, it burns a ton of mental calories, it takes time, and it demands your full attention. And that's exactly why your brain, which is always looking to save energy, avoids using it unless it absolutely has to. And this quote just nails the nature of your fast system. It's always on, always scanning the environment, and it acts immediately based on patterns, emotions, and past experiences. It doesn't need your approval to get things done. It just acts. Okay, so if we have these two systems, one slow and deliberate, the other fast and automatic, it begs a pretty critical question. Who is calling the shots most of the time? Well, the reality is kind of staggering. Research suggests that about 95% of your daily decisions, we're talking everything from hitting the snooze button to judging a stranger's character, are handled by the fast system. That leaves a tiny 5% for your conscious, slow system. And this is really the core takeaway here. For almost everything you do, think, and feel throughout your day, your automatic, unconscious system is the one at the helm. So here's the real sequence of events. First, a situation happens. But crucially, before your conscious mind even has a clue what's going on, your fast system has already interpreted it and started leaning toward a choice. Your conscious self is literally the last to get the memo. I mean, this just flips our whole understanding on its head. We think we decide everything from scratch, but in reality, by the time we even start thinking about a choice, a decision has already been drafted by our autopilot. But hold on, this isn't the end of the story. Because after your fast system has made its move, something else happens. And this is where our whole understanding of choice gets really interesting. It's this super subtle, almost invisible step in the process. It happens so quickly that we almost never catch it in the act. This is the moment your slow system, your conscious self, finally enters the scene. It finally becomes aware of both the situation and that lean that the fast system has already created. And here is the twist. It shows up, but not for the reason you think. It's not there to carefully weigh the options and make the final call. Its primary job isn't to decide. So if your conscious mind isn't there to make the decision, then what is its true purpose? Well, it seems its real power lies somewhere else. It can either veto the impulse from the fast system, or, and this is what happens most of the time, it creates a rational story explaining the choice that was already made, which leaves us with a final, fascinating question. Are you the driver of your choices, or are you just the storyteller? All right, welcome back. We're jumping right back in with a huge one of the biggest questions there is. How does your brain really make a choice? So let's just start right there. I mean, think about it for a second. When you decide to do something, anything at all, who's actually calling the shots? You probably think the answer is obvious. It's you, right? Well, maybe not. We all have this feeling, don't we? That there's a little me sitting in the driver's seat of our brain, the one who's carefully thinking things through, weighing the options, and making the final call. But what if that whole feeling is, well, wrong? What if your conscious mind, that voice in your head, doesn't actually create the decision at all? What if its real job is just to explain the decision after your brain has already made it? It's like a storyteller, quickly coming up with a perfectly logical reason for an action that your automatic system already set in motion. And this brings us to this really powerful idea, the mind's storyteller. This is the absolute key to understanding why it feels so much like you're in control, even when the reality is a whole lot more automatic than we think. So let's be super clear about this. Your inner storyteller is basically a sense-making machine. It takes whatever your fast, automatic system spits out, a gut feeling, a sudden urge, an impulse, and it instantly wraps a logical story around it. It makes you feel like you were the rational one who weighed all the options, when actually you're just narrating a conclusion that was already there. Okay, but hang on. This raises a really interesting question. If we all have this storyteller built into our heads, then why can two people look at the exact same thing and come away with completely different opinions? Why do we disagree so much? Well, here's the thing. The answer usually isn't about logic. It's about the raw material each person's storyteller has to work with. See, our automatic systems are all shaped by a totally unique mix of past experiences, beliefs, and emotions. So, of course, they interpret the same event in completely different ways. The stories just follow suit. So why? Why would our brains be built like this? It really all comes down to one simple evolutionary need: the need for speed. Let's walk through this, because it's super important. Your brain can't possibly process every single detail of the world around you in real time. It would just overload and shut down. So it has to simplify things. It creates mental shortcuts, patterns, and just fills in the gaps based on past experience. And this works great. It makes you incredibly fast and efficient. But there's a trade-off, a big one. All those shortcuts, they also make you predictable. And that predictability, well, that's where things get really, really interesting. Because those super efficient shortcuts, they can also be turned into vulnerabilities. I mean, the logic here is pretty straightforward, right? If the patterns your brain uses to make snap judgments are consistent, if they're predictable, then it means someone else can understand those patterns. And anything that can be understood, well, it can also be influenced. Now, we're not talking about mind control or anything like that. The tools of influence are way more subtle. It could be an idea you hear over and over again, or a tone of voice that just feels familiar and trustworthy, maybe an emotional trigger that hits at just the right moment. The goal is to make a suggestion feel so natural, so obvious, that your brain just accepts it like it was its own idea all along. And this gets us to the final, really critical idea for today. The most powerful kind of influence isn't about arguing or forcing someone to change their mind. It's about alignment. This is really the main takeaway. Real influence, the kind that actually works, doesn't need to push or to argue. It just needs to find and align with the patterns that are already running the show inside somebody's head. So, to put it another way, someone isn't forcing a new idea into your head. Nope. They're just activating a pathway that's already there. They're giving you information in a way that just clicks with your brain's existing shortcuts, making their conclusion feel like it's your own common sense. And this leads to a much deeper, maybe even a more unsettling thought. What if all those internal patterns that guide your choices, what if they aren't just random? What if they can be switched on deliberately? What if they can be strengthened just through repetition? What if they can be, well, used to guide you toward a predictable outcome? Which, of course, brings us to our final question. If our predictable brains can be influenced by aligning with these patterns, then what are the exact levers? The specific triggers and techniques that pull the strings. Well, that's what we're going to dig into in our next explainer. When you hear the word influence, what pops into your head? You probably picture a big, forceful argument, right? Or maybe some super charismatic leader. But what if I told you that the most powerful kinds of influence are the complete opposite? What if they're quiet, subtle, and work with a kind of precision that's almost impossible to see? Well, today, we're going to pull back that curtain and look at the hidden mechanics of how our minds actually get changed. First things first, let's get a core idea on the table. Real, lasting influence, it has nothing to do with force. It's not about bullying someone into a decision or just overwhelming them with pressure. And it's definitely not about control. I mean, think about it. The second you feel like a puppet on a string, what happens? Your defenses go way, way up. The most effective influence never feels like someone's ordering you around. It feels like it was your own idea all along. So, if it's not force and it's not control, what in the world is it? The secret sauce? It's all about precision. It's kind of like a key in a lock. Trying to smash the door down is just going to get you nowhere, but the right key with the right shape in exactly the right place, it opens effortlessly. That's how influence works. It makes these tiny, calculated shifts that tap into the predictable ways we all think and behave. And this is the central secret, really. Influence is so powerful because our behavior, even though it feels super complex, isn't totally random. Not at all. Our brains are actually hardwired with all these mental shortcuts and automatic responses. So powerful influence doesn't have to carve out brand new pathways in our minds, it just anticipates and uses the ones that are already there. Okay, so let's check out our first invisible lever, what we'll call the authority shortcut. Look, our brains are basically energy-saving machines. They're always looking for a way to do less work. And one of the best ways to do that? Just trust a source that seems credible. It lets us completely bypass a ton of heavy mental lifting. And what's really wild is how this all happens automatically, without you even thinking about it. We see something that looks credible, a doctor in a white lab coat, a fancy logo from a big institution, a name we recognize, and boom, instantly, our critical thinking just relaxes its guard. That need to really dig in and question the information gets smaller and smaller, because our brains basically outsource the job of checking it. And just like that, trust becomes the default setting. It's this thought, right? Or some version of it that just flashes through our minds before we can even grab it. It's a split-second assumption, a quick calculation. And why does our brain do it? Because it feels efficient. It feels safe. It's a mental shortcut that, honestly, serves us pretty well most of the time. But you gotta remember, it's also a lever that can be pulled. All right, on to our second lever, which we'll call the familiarity engine. This one is powered by something incredibly simple but unbelievably powerful. Just plain repetition. The more we are exposed to something, the more it actually changes how we feel about it on a fundamental level. This chain reaction is just so potent. It starts simply. You see an idea, a name, a product, again and again and again. That repetition just makes it feel, familiar. And our brains are wired to connect that feeling of familiarity with safety, with comfort. And over time, that cozy feeling of comfort quietly starts to morph into a sense of trust, even if there's absolutely no logical reason for that trust to exist. And here is the absolute crucial insight. Our brain doesn't always prefer what's true. A lot of the time, it just prefers what feels known. Why? Because the known takes less energy to process. It cuts down on uncertainty. Repetition makes an idea feel like a comfy old armchair in your mind. It's been there so long, it just feels like it belongs. So when you boil it all down, this gets to the emotional core of why these levers are so effective. They're not appealing to our logic. They're appealing to our brain's most basic desires. Authority whispers to us that something is safe and efficient. Familiarity tells us something is comfortable and known. Both are incredibly sneaky ways to get around our critical thinking. Now, look, understanding these levers one by one is one thing. But here's the kicker. They almost never work alone. The real power, and frankly the real danger, is what happens when these forces start to combine and feed off of each other. So let's just ask that question. What happens when a message is repeated over and over and over by a source that seems totally authoritative? Well, the comfort you get from something familiar starts to merge with the safety you feel from a credible source. Each lever makes the other one stronger, creating this powerful, self-reinforcing feedback loop. And that is the exact point where influence becomes truly invisible. It doesn't feel like a message coming from the outside anymore. It just feels like our own common sense, like an undeniable truth. By understanding these levers, authority and familiarity, we can start to see this hidden architecture of influence that is all around us. So the real challenge then isn't just knowing that they exist, it's learning to catch them at work in our own thinking. You ever have that feeling like you're just running in place? You're pushing harder and harder, but you're not getting anywhere new? It's super frustrating, right? Well, in this explainer, we're going to unpack the psychology behind why we get so stuck and why sometimes putting in more effort is actually the worst thing you can do. Yeah, this probably hits home for a lot of you. You change your tactics, you try a new method, you put in more hours, and what happens? You end up right back at square one. It's a maddening feeling, and trust me, it's not just you. It's a sign that there's a hidden pattern at play, a kind of psychological loop that's trapping you right under the surface. So, this gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? We're all taught that if we fail, it's because we didn't try hard enough. But what if that's completely wrong? What if the problem isn't how hard you're pushing, but the direction you're pushing in? What if your whole strategy was flawed from the very beginning? Okay, to figure that out, we've got to understand the shape of the trap itself. It's this very specific pattern that keeps us repeating our failures over and over. And believe me, once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's called the strategy failure loop. Here's a way to think about it. Imagine trying to build a house, but your foundation is totally crooked. You can use the best materials, work 24/7, but that house is always going to be tilted, right? The problem was never your effort. It was the flawed approach you started with. It's a system literally designed to fail and then do it all over again. Let's trace the steps of this loop because it's kind of sneaky. It all starts with a flawed approach, but you think the issue is effort, so you double down. You try harder. Unsurprisingly, this leads to the exact same outcome. But here's the insidious part. That failure amps up your frustration, which makes you want to push even harder on that same broken strategy. And bam, just like that, the loop starts all over again. Okay, so if we're stuck in this crazy loop, why can't we just see it and step out? Well, it's because of another really powerful psychological force at play. The illusion of control. We think we're in the driver's seat, when in reality, something else is often steering the car. Just look at this. This shows the huge gap between our perception and reality. On the left, that's the neat, logical story we tell ourselves. Our brain makes a decision, we act on it, we get an outcome. Clean. But now look at the right. This is often what's really happening. Some external trigger happens, it sparks an emotional response inside you, and that feeling drives an automatic, almost knee-jerk behavior. And we call this the reactive illusion model. It's this deeply ingrained belief that we are the authors of our actions, when in fact, we're often just reactors. We're responding to these subconscious cues from our environment without even having a clue that it's happening. Let's break this down with an example. First, an external trigger. Let's say you get a stressful email. This sparks an immediate emotional response, maybe a flash of anger or anxiety. That emotion then drives a reactive behavior, like firing back a snarky reply. And here's the magic trick. After you've already hit send, your conscious mind swoops in and creates a perfectly logical story, a justification, that makes it seem like you were in rational control the whole time. That's the illusion. So, if we're just reacting, what are we reacting to? What are these hidden forces pulling our strings? Well, that brings us to what we call the 3 invisible levers of influence. It starts with something incredibly simple and human, something we all do 1,000 times a day. You look at others. This first lever is social proof. It's an automatic, hardwired behavior. We are social creatures, so we are constantly scanning our environment to see what everyone else is doing. And why does this happen automatically? Because it's a brilliant mental shortcut. Instead of doing the hard work of figuring out what's correct or acceptable, our brain just outsources the decision to the crowd. It helps us feel safe, like we belong, and it shields us from that primal fear of being an outsider. This pull is incredibly powerful, and it happens completely without our permission. The second lever? This one is maybe the most potent of all, emotion, and specifically fear. When fear enters the equation, our entire mental landscape just shifts. Rational thought gets shoved right into the back seat. So, what does fear actually do to our minds? Well, it gives you tunnel vision, laser focusing you only on the threat. It hijacks your system for speed, prioritizing survival over analysis, and critically, it shuts down our ability to question. When you're afraid, you don't reflect, you react. And a reaction is much, much easier for someone else to control. And now for our third lever, urgency. This one kicks in whenever something feels scarce or temporary, or like it requires immediate action. You know the vibe, limited time offer or deadline approaching. The moment we feel that time pressure, our brain shifts gears. It stops trying to solve the complex maze and just looks for the fastest, most direct path out. It skips the deeper analysis and it removes our natural mental resistance. Because here's a good rule of thumb: speed kills skepticism. And here is the most important thing to understand about all of this. When these levers, social proof, fear, and urgency, are all pulled at the same time, they don't feel like influence. No way. They feel like certainty. They bypass your critical thinking and create this deep gut feeling that you are absolutely 100% right. And that is a feeling we almost never question. This brings us to the final and most important part of this whole puzzle. We've seen the loops that trap us and the invisible levers that drive our reactions. So, what's the way out? Well, it isn't to fight these forces head-on. It's actually just to shift our perspective. And this is the ultimate takeaway. You can't stop these levers from existing in the world, but you can learn to see them for what they are. Once you have this framework, the loops, the illusion, the levers, you can't unsee it. You'll start noticing these patterns everywhere, in advertising, in politics, at your job, and most importantly, in your own reactive behavior. And that awareness, that is the first, most essential step to taking back control. So I'll leave you with this question to carry with you. Now that you know what to look for, the pull of the crowd, the rush of fear, the pressure of urgency, where will you see these invisible levers first? Because simply recognizing them, that's where the real work begins.
You know, we spend so much of our lives talking, listening, writing, but what if the most honest conversation you'll ever have is one that doesn't use any words at all? Well, today, we're going to explore that hidden language.
So here's the core idea we're starting with. Communication, it isn't something you just turn on and off like a light switch. Nope, it is a constant broadcast. Whether you're in a big meeting, just waiting for the bus, or sitting with a friend, you are sending out information all the time.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Because you see, silence isn't a void. It isn't the absence of communication. It is a form of communication. That pause before an answer, a quiet stare, the choice not to say something, it's all part of the message. That broadcast, it never actually stops.
Okay, so if we're communicating all the time, but we're almost entirely focused on just the words, then what are we missing, right? What is this huge stream of information that's just flowing right past us, totally unnoticed? That's the big question we're digging into.
So that leads us right into our first big idea, the hidden conversation. And this is all about that gap, that space between what someone says and what their actions are really telling us.
So, what even makes up this hidden conversation? Well, it's everything. I mean, think about it. The tiny, almost invisible flutter of an eyelid. That split-second pause before someone answers a simple question. Or the subtle way they shift their weight from one foot to the other. Every single one of these is a piece of data. It's a piece of the story.
So why on earth do we miss all of this? The answer is actually pretty simple. We're just wired to focus on words. Our brains lock on, we analyze the meaning, and while we're doing all that, we completely tune out the much louder story that's being told right in front of our eyes.
And this is where you have to draw a really clear line. Words are what is said, right? They're the message we carefully put together. But behavior is how it's all expressed. It's the raw, unfiltered context. You could say one is the script, but the other, that's the real performance. And that performance, well, it tells a much deeper, more honest story.
Okay, so if behavior is the real performance, how do we even start to read it? Well, that brings us to our next idea, the body's honest signal. It's all about learning to spot the two basic states the body is always broadcasting, comfort and discomfort. Think about it like this. When someone is genuinely comfortable, their movements have this natural rhythm. They're smooth, they're unforced. But when their internal state changes, maybe they hear something they don't like or get asked a tough question, the body reacts, and suddenly you see these subtle hesitations, these tiny, abrupt shifts. That easy rhythm's broken.
And these little reactions, they're not just random tics or meaningless fidgeting. No, they are signals. And here's the crucial part. A signal is a physical reaction that is tied directly to an internal change.
It's the body's way of basically screaming, hey, something just happened in here.
And here's what you should be looking for. We're not talking about some wild, dramatic gestures here. It's the small stuff. That brief hesitation before speaking, a slight delay in their response, a subtle shift in how they're sitting or standing. These are the real markers of that internal change.
Now, this all leads us to a really critical idea, the moment of truth. We're about to see exactly why these signals are so darn reliable. And it all comes down to a race between the body and the mind.
And here it is. This is the whole secret. The body reacts instantly. It's honest, because it doesn't have a choice. The conscious brain, though, it needs a moment. It has to process what just happened, and then decide what to say about it. And that tiny gap, that little delay, is everything. The physical signal gets out before the filter of language can even kick in.
So let's just break it down. Step 1. Something happens that causes an internal shift, right? Emotionally, cognitively, whatever. Step 2, the body reacts to that shift immediately. That's your signal. And only then, step 3, does the brain finally formulate the words to explain or justify or maybe even cover up that reaction. The behavior always comes first.
And if you remember just one thing from all of this, let it be this. This is the simple, powerful reason why behavior gives us a more accurate glimpse into what's really going on. The body doesn't have time to lie. The words do.
So, where does all this leave us? Well, in our final section, we're talking about learning to see. And this isn't about becoming some kind of mind reader. Not at all. It's about becoming a better observer of what's real.
That tiny little moment, that window of time after something happens, but before the words are formed, that is your moment of truth. It's a fleeting glimpse behind the curtain. It's a look at the unfiltered, authentic reaction. For just a brief moment, it reveals what is real.
But, seeing this stuff really requires two things. First, you have to know where to look, not just at their face, but at their whole body, their posture, their hands, that rhythm we talked about. And second, and this is just as important, you have to be willing to notice. You have to consciously decide to shift your attention away from just the words and be open to seeing the entire picture.
And that's the real question, isn't it? We've talked about this hidden conversation that's happening all around us all the time. We've explored the honest signals the body sends out. You have the framework now. So as you go about your day, in your next meeting, your next conversation, now that you know where to look, what will you notice?
We're constantly trying to read people, right? Every single day. But what about when the signals get all crossed up? That's what we're diving in today. Those hidden clues in communication. Those moments where what someone says and what they do, well, they just don't line up. So let's get right into it. I mean, we've all felt this, haven't we? That weird, confusing moment. Someone's words are saying one thing, but their tone, their body language, it's all screaming something totally different. So what's happening in that gap? What's really going on there? Well, that gap, that's where we find our first big clue. We're calling it the subtle glitch. And it's all about learning to spot those teeny tiny moments where the communication just feels, well, off. It's like this momentary breakdown, and honestly, it's so easy to miss. So what is it, really? At its core, the glitch is just that, a simple moment of disconnect. A little inconsistency between the words someone uses and what their behavior is actually showing you. Okay, so picture this. Someone's up at a podium and they say, "I'm confident about this plan." But as they're saying it, their voice is kind of hesitant, The timing is just a little bit off. The words are screaming confidence, but their behavior, it's just leaking pure uncertainty. That, right there, is the glitch. And that's the feeling, right? When you're the one watching. It's this internal sense that, something just doesn't quite line up here. It's almost like a quiet little alarm bell going off in your head. One that, let's be honest, most of us are just trained to ignore. So why do we ignore it? It's simple, really. It takes energy. Noticing these little glitches requires actual focus. And when you're in the middle of a fast-moving conversation, it's easier to let it slide, right? Just focus on the words and move on. But, and this is the part that changes everything. A single glitch? It could just be a mistake, a slip-up, no big deal. But when you start seeing it happen again and again, oh yeah, that's when you know something much bigger is going on. Because as they say, patterns don't lie.
And that right there brings us to our next big idea, something way more powerful than just a glitch. It's the unspoken pattern. This is where we go from just spotting clues to actually understanding what they mean. So a pattern isn't just a one-off thing. It's a repeated inconsistency. It's when you see that same exact mismatch between words and behavior over and over again. And eventually, that repetition itself, it starts to reveal some kind of deeper, unspoken truth. And listen, this is where the real power is. This isn't about some kind of superpower like mind reading. It's just about clarity. You actually start to recognize when someone is truly engaged, or when they're actually unsure, even if they say they're not. And this is the big one. You start to see when they're actively trying to influence you. Okay, so this begs a pretty big question, right? If these patterns are the clues, what are they pointing to? Where do all these repeated glitches even come from? Well, the answer lies in our next section, the traces of influence. And the main idea here is super simple. These patterns, they are not random. Think of them more like footprints left behind by something very specific. See, every time someone tries to persuade you or manage how you see something, or even just guide a conversation, basically any act of influence, it leaves behind these subtle little traces. Now, let's be super clear here. We're not talking about some big flashing neon sign that says, "I'm trying to influence you." No. These traces are subtle. But, and this is the key, they are absolutely detectable. You just have to learn to look for the patterns, not just listen to the words. So, this is where it gets really, really interesting. Once you actually start detecting these patterns, these traces of influence, what happens then? What do you even begin to see? How does your whole view of the world start to shift? And that brings us to our final and honestly most profound idea, the constant current. This is about finally understanding the true nature of influence in our everyday lives. You know, the very first thing you'll notice when your eyes are open to this is just how often it's happening, the sheer frequency. You'll start to realize that this whole influence thing, it's not some rare event. It's happening all the time, constantly, even in places you would never, ever expect. It's funny, we tend to think influence is this thing that only, salespeople or politicians do. But what you learn once you see the patterns is that it's not rare, not at all. It is constant. It's like this invisible current flowing underneath pretty much every single human interaction. It's happening in the boardroom, for sure, but it's also at the dinner table. It's even in a casual chat with a friend. It is always there. So think about it. We went from spotting one tiny little glitch all the way to seeing this constant current. Now that you know these traces exist, that these patterns are just waiting to be seen, what will you start to notice? What truths have been hiding in plain sight this whole time? Now that's the real question, isn't it? Ever stop to think about what's really shaping your digital world? Turns out, it's something built right into the environment you use every single day. Today, we're going to unpack that very structure. Okay, let's get into it. This quote, it really is the key to this whole thing. See, we tend to think of influence as these one-off events, right? A clever ad, a shocking article. But what we're looking at here is a totally different idea. That influence is more like the air you breathe online. It's not an event, it's a constant. So that brings us to this term, continuous influence. What on earth does that mean? Well, think of it less like a big, loud push and more like an entire digital world, an architecture designed specifically to guide what you think and what you do. And it works through these tiny, persistent, subtle little interactions that are happening all the time. To really get this, we've got to start by peeling back the first layer, the most immediate one. We're talking about the triggers that are specifically designed to get a response from us before we even have a chance to think. And the most classic example, the perfect place to start, is advertising. Ads are kind of like the frontline soldiers of influence, designed for pure speed. They're not there to start a long, thoughtful conversation. Nope, they're built for something way, way faster. So how do they get that speed? Well, modern digital ads hardly ever just list facts and figures, do they? Instead, they aim straight for your emotions. Joy, desire, that feeling of needing to belong. Why? Because an emotional hook is just so much faster and, frankly, more powerful than a logical argument. But, it's not just ads. Think about all the articles and videos that clog up your feeds. The number one tool of influence there? The headline. And just like an ad, it's been carefully engineered for that instant impact.
And here's where we see a subtle but really crucial difference. Advertising, a lot of the time, wants to trigger an immediate action. Click here, buy now. Headlines, on the other hand, are often designed to shape an immediate reaction, like outrage or surprise or that feeling of validation. Both are trying to bypass deep thought, but their goals are just a little bit different. So what kind of reactions are they gunning for? Usually the most primal ones. Curiosity, making you feel like you have to know the answer. Fear, which grabs our attention like almost nothing else. And agreement, which gives you that little rush of feeling validated. These are basically the engines of instant engagement. So that's layer one, those instant triggers. But this whole architecture is so much more sophisticated than that. Now let's dive into how this all builds into an interactive system, one that actually learns from you. Now this is a point that is just so important. The stream of content you scroll through every day, it doesn't matter if it's on social media, a news site, or a video platform, it is not a random lottery. It's a deliberately constructed space. Your feed is the end result of a whole process. Content is selected from millions of options. Then it's filtered based on what the system predicts you'll want. And finally, it's optimized to do one primary thing: keep you there, to hold your attention and keep you engaged. Because your attention, that's the real currency here. And this is the part where you become part of the machine. Your engagement isn't passive. Every second you spend, every scroll, every time you pause in a video, it's an act of teaching. You're actively giving data that makes the system smarter about one thing: you. You're not just a consumer of the feed. You're kind of its co-creator. It's this constant feedback loop. The system shows you some content. You either react to it or, and this is just as important, you ignore it. The system learns from that signal, and then it adjusts what it shows you next. This loop runs continuously, thousands of times a day, totally in the background. So let's just pause on that for a second. As you're scrolling and clicking and watching, what information are you actually handing over? What is this system actually learning? It's really learning three critical things. It learns your triggers, what makes you stop and engage. It learns your turnoffs, what makes you just scroll right on by. And maybe most importantly, it's slowly figuring out the secret formula for what holds your attention for the longest possible time. Okay, so now we get to the final piece of the puzzle. We've seen the instant triggers, we've seen the learning loop. So what's the ultimate outcome of this constant, quiet process? What does it all add up to? Right, so here's the kicker. All that learning isn't just sitting in a database somewhere. It has a direct consequence. The data you provide today actively builds the digital world you're going to live in tomorrow. Your past engagement literally dictates your future experience. And this change, it doesn't happen with a big bang. It's not a sudden shift. It happens gradually, almost without you noticing. Post by post, video by video. It's so quiet that most of the time, we don't even realize the environment around us is changing. But all those tiny, quiet adjustments, they add up. Over time, they stop being random. They start to form a predictable world built just for you. A world that feels complete, but is really just a mirror reflecting your own reactions back at you. And that's the architecture. It's not just designed to show you things, it's designed to shape the very reality you see online. And that leaves us with one final thing to think about. This process, this isn't some abstract idea. It's happening right now for every single one of us. So the real question isn't if it's happening. The question is, as your digital world learns from your every move, what specific patterns is it building for you? What kind of world is it creating in your feed and in your mind? All right, let's just jump right in. We're all swimming in this massive ocean of information, right? Every single day. But what if the currents are pulling us in directions we don't even realize? That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to explore the hidden architecture behind all that information we consume and how it's, well, quietly shaping who we are. You know that feeling? I'm sure you do. You're just scrolling through your feed, and you get this weird sense of déjà vu. Like you're seeing the same headlines, the same takes, the same kinds of stories, just again and again. It's like you're caught in some kind of information loop. So here's the thing. That's not an accident. Not at all. It's actually a core part of how influence works. Let's call it the repetition loop. It's this constant cycle of seeing and hearing the same stuff until it stops feeling like an idea and starts feeling like reality itself. And what's so wild is how specific it is. You're not just seeing random things on repeat. You're seeing the same ideas, you're seeing the same perspectives, and maybe the most powerful of all, you're seeing the same emotional patterns. Outrage, then inspiration, then fear, then outrage again. It's like it's training you not just on what to think, but on how to feel.
Okay, so how does a simple loop like that actually get inside our heads? It's not magic, it's just psychology. There's a pretty straightforward formula at play here that takes something that's merely familiar and makes it feel like it's the absolute truth.
And here it is, broken down. It's a classic trick of the human brain. First, you just see something over and over. That's repetition. It makes an idea feel familiar. Then, because it's familiar, you start to just accept it. It doesn't seem weird or threatening anymore. And then comes the big jump. That feeling of acceptance, that comfort, it starts to feel exactly like truth.
And this, right here, is the key. That gut feeling that something is true isn't always based on facts. A lot of the time, it's just based on the comfort of familiarity. It's a mental shortcut, And it's a shortcut that can lead us to believe things that just aren't real.
Now, that shortcut gets reinforced on a much smaller scale, too. It's happening at the micro level, where influence is so subtle it's almost invisible. Let's zoom in on the power of a single word, because sometimes that's all it takes to change, everything.
And look, this isn't just about social media feeds or news headlines. This stuff weaves its way into our actual real-life conversations. The way a friend tells a story, the way a coworker talks about something that happened, it's all part of the same subtle process of shaping our reality.
Just look at this. It's the perfect example. On the left, you have protesters flood city streets. Okay, now look at the right. Rioters invade city streets. These two headlines could be describing the exact same event, but they create two completely different worlds in your mind, right? One is about civic action, the other is about chaos and violence. All because of one word. Protesters versus rioters, flood versus invade. It changes everything. And that's the whole principle in a nutshell. It's the word choice, it's the tone, it's the way something is framed that guides how we perceive it. It's the art of influence, and it happens right out in the open. But here's the kicker. Most of the time, we don't even see it happening. It just slides right past us. Why? Because these words, these frames, they fit the familiar patterns we've already seen 1,000 times. So our brains don't even flag it as something to question. It just feels normal. So what do we do about this? Well, the first step is just awareness. It's about consciously hitting pause on that constant stream of information and just stepping back, trying to see the structure behind it all, to finally see the unseen architecture. And when you do that, when you start to see the patterns, you realize something huge. Your relationship with all this information, it's not passive. You're not just an empty bucket being filled up with facts and stories. And that is the absolute heart of it. You are being shaped by it. Every single article, every video, every conversation, it's all leaving a little mark. It's actively building the lens you use to see the entire world. Which brings us to the final, and honestly the most personal part of all of this. Because this constant, subtle influence, it isn't just about changing your mind on some issue or another. Yeah, it goes way, way deeper than just your surface-level opinions. It works its way down into the very foundation of how you see yourself and how you see your place in the world. Ultimately, this is where it's all heading. The information you consume literally helps build who you are, your identity. It informs what groups you feel a part of, what you believe in, what you're against. It helps tell the story of you to yourself. And that right there, that connection to our identity, that's what makes this influence so unbelievably powerful. Because once an idea gets tangled up with our sense of self, we don't just agree with it anymore, we defend it. We defend it like we're defending ourselves. An attack on the idea feels like a personal attack. So that really leaves us with one big question, doesn't it? We've seen how this whole system works, how repetition and subtle language build a structure around us, a structure that ends up shaping our very identity. So if all that information is the architect of who you're becoming, who are you giving the blueprints to?
Okay, so let's talk about you. Who are you really? It's probably the biggest question there is. And today, we're going to dive into the architecture of your identity, how that you that you walk around with every single day actually gets built.
You know that feeling, right? It just feels solid. Like the person you are right now is the same person you were 5 years ago, and the same one you'll be 5 years from now.
It's this deep, intuitive feeling that there's an unchanging core at the very center of your being.
But here's the kicker. Is that feeling actually true? Is your sense of self really this fixed, permanent thing? Or is there something completely different going on under the hood? Let's take a look.
So, first, let's just sit with that powerful intuition we all have, this feeling of being you. Turns out it has a few key characteristics for almost everybody.
For one, it feels stable. It's like your personal anchor in the middle of a chaotic world. It's that one constant thing you can always come back to. That voice in your head, it just seems like it's always been there, right?
And another thing, it feels like it comes from the inside out. Like this isn't something the world gave you, it's something that you just are deep down. It's your essence, something that is uniquely and totally yours. And when you add it all up, the feeling is that it's fixed, unchanging. And that's a really comforting idea, that your identity is this solid foundation. But, and this is a big but, that feeling, as strong as it is, might actually be pointing us in the wrong direction.
So let's flip this whole idea on its head. What if your identity isn't some static thing you have to discover, but something dynamic that you actually build?
Yeah, that whole feeling of being fixed, it isn't the whole story. Not even close. The reality is so much more fluid, and honestly, way more fascinating.
And this is the central idea we're talking about today, a built identity. The concept here is that your self isn't found, it's forged. It gets constructed piece by piece, day by day, using the raw materials of your life.
Putting it side by side like this makes it super clear. What we feel is that we're fixed, stable, and that it's all internal. But the reality? We are built. We're fluid, and we're constantly being shaped by outside inputs. Now, that is a huge shift in thinking about who we are.
Okay, so if we're building our identity, what are we using? Where do the bricks and mortar for our sense of self actually come from?
Well, the answer is kind of simple and also huge. It's everything. Every single thing you see, hear, and interact with. It's not just data your brain is processing. It's the literal raw material that's building you. Seriously, just think about your average day. The stuff you see over and over in your social media feeds, the podcasts you listen to on your commute, the conversations you have. None of that just washes over you. It's all laying the foundation for the person you're becoming. And this isn't magic. There's a system to it. First, you get exposed to a new idea. Then, through repetition, you see it and hear about it again and again and again. And finally, it gets reinforced. Your friends agree, you see it online, and so on. And just like that, an idea from the outside becomes a belief on the inside.
So we have the raw materials, our experiences. But what about the blueprint? What's the plan that guides the construction? Well, that's where our social environment comes in.
And I can't say this strongly enough. The people you surround yourself with, your friends, your family, the people you work with, they are maybe the most powerful force of all in building who you are. So how do they do it? It's through this constant, often subtle, feedback loop. It's in their opinions, it's in how they react to the things you say and do, and it's in their expectations for how you're supposed to be. All of that creates a really powerful framework. And what this social framework does is it sets a baseline. It quietly tells you what's normal, what's acceptable, what's cool within your group. And as humans, we are incredibly tuned in to that baseline. And here's the science behind why we tend to just go with it. It's a principle called social alignment. Your brain is basically built to be efficient, to conserve energy. And resisting your social group, going against the grain, takes a ton of mental energy. It's just easier to align. It's why you might laugh at a joke you don't really get if everyone else is laughing. It's the path of least resistance. So all of this brings us to one final and really crucial question. If your identity isn't fixed, if it is in fact built from the inputs you choose and the social blueprints all around you, then who is actually in charge of the construction? Who is the architect? And the most powerful realization of all is that the answer can be you.
All right, let's talk about something that's at the very core of who we are, our identity. I mean, how does a simple thought go from being just an idea to being an unshakable part of you? Well, that's what we're going to unpack today. So just think about that for a second. What really happens when an idea stops being something you just agree with and becomes woven into the very fabric of who you believe you are? What's the change that happens right there, in that moment? First up, we're going to look at how our minds literally build a fortress around certain beliefs. We're talking about how simple ideas get transformed into something much, much bigger and way more powerful.
And this right here is the crucial shift. The moment an idea crosses that line from something I think to someone I am, well, the whole game changes completely. See, it stops being this abstract concept you can just examine from a distance. It's not just another tool in your intellectual toolkit anymore. All of a sudden, it's like a piece of territory that you own. And just like any territory you feel belongs to you, your first instinct is to guard its borders. And you don't just protect it passively, right? You're not just standing guard. You actively go on the defense against any attack, any criticism, anything that even smells like a challenge to it. It's a total reflex. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This defense mechanism, it's not always logical. The feeling of being right suddenly becomes way more important than the actual facts. The defense is emotional, it's not rational. And this is the reason why. An attack on the idea is no longer just an attack on a concept. To your brain, it feels like a personal attack on you, on your character, your intelligence, your entire sense of self. You know, this feeling actually has a name. It's called resistance. It's that defensive, gut-level reaction you get when one of your core beliefs gets challenged. It's basically your brain's alarm system going off, trying to avoid the discomfort of two conflicting ideas. It's the alarm for your idea fortress. Okay, but this isn't just about how we feel inside. It's about what we actually do. So now we're going to explore how that identity becomes a kind of automatic pilot for our lives. Its real power is just how subtle it is. It runs in the background, guiding your choices without you even having to think about it. It basically sets your default path in life. Just look at how this flows. It's a subconscious loop. Let's say you believe you're an environmentally conscious person. Well, you'll automatically start making decisions that reinforce that belief, like buying the eco-friendly product at the store. You're not just picking an item, you're acting in a way that's consistent with your own self-image. And here is where the whole thing gets turned on its head. That sense of self, that idea of who you believe you are, that feels so personal, so deep, so yours, well, it might not be. So this brings us to a pretty unsettling question. If our identity is the pilot, who helped draw the map? Let's take a look at how our identity is quietly sculpted by forces we barely even notice. It's really that simple and that profound. Your identity isn't created in a vacuum. Nope, it's nudged, it's molded, and it's shaped from the outside. So how does this actually happen? It's not some big dramatic event. It's more like a slow drip. It happens gradually, so you don't really notice the change. It happens quietly, so it doesn't trigger your defenses, and it happens over a long period of time until eventually the new belief feels like it was yours all along. And this is why this is so important. If the very foundation, your identity, can be influenced, then the entire structure of your beliefs, your actions, everything built on top of it can also be influenced. So the big question is, where is this all happening? Where is this quiet, gradual shaping of who we are taking place most effectively today? Let's bring this whole idea into the here and now. This is it. The online spaces we live in, our social media feeds, the videos we watch, the articles we read, they have become the primary battlegrounds for identity construction. They are the most powerful tools for this gradual, quiet, long-term influence that humanity has ever seen. And that leaves us with one final and maybe the most important question of all. If our sense of self is being sculpted, a lot of times without us even knowing it, it forces us to ask who or what is doing the sculpting? Who is holding the tools?
Have you ever just, stopped and thought about all the amazing stuff you use online every day for free? I mean, social media, search engines, all these platforms, they connect us, they keep us in the loop, and they're all totally free. But how? How do these companies even make money if they're not charging us a dime? Well, that is the big question. And the answer? It's not what you think. Let's get into it. No, really, just let that sink in for a second. We're talking about some of the richest, most influential companies in the history of the world. And the main thing they offer, the thing we all use, costs nothing. It doesn't make sense, right? It goes against everything we know about business.
And look, this isn't some accident or a temporary sale. It's not a gimmick. It is the core design of a whole economic system. There's a very specific, very deliberate logic at play here.
And this one idea, this changes everything.
See, when a product doesn't cost you anything, it's a huge clue that you aren't the one they're trying to sell to. The real customers are somewhere else. They're the ones footing the bill. So if you're not the customer, what does that make you?
And there it is. That's the secret sauce. This is the idea that makes this whole thing tick. Your activity, your engagement, your time online, that is the valuable thing that's being bundled up and sold. You're not buying the product, you are the product being sold to the real customers.
Oh, you're definitely paying, all right? You're just not using money. The very first thing you hand over is your attention. Think about it. Those seconds and minutes you spend staring at a screen are a limited resource. And for advertisers, that resource is pure gold. Your attention is the first thing they collect and sell to the highest bidder.
But it gets so much deeper than just what you look at. Yeah, your attention is valuable for sure. But your behavior, what you actually do, that is the grand prize. It's a much richer, way more detailed, and far more profitable thing to track.
And let's be super clear about the scale here. We're not just talking about the obvious stuff, like the posts you like or the people you follow. The system is built from the ground up to capture, well, everything. I mean, literally everything.
Every single time your finger taps a link, a button, or a picture, yep, it's logged. That's another tiny piece of data.
Heck, even when you're doing nothing, you're giving them information. How long do you hesitate on a post before you keep scrolling? That pause, right there, it's measured. It means something. Maybe you're interested. Maybe you're disgusted. Either way, it's useful data.
And of course, how long you look is critical. Did you watch 3 seconds of that video, or did you watch the entire thing? Did you just glance at that photo, or did you zoom in? That viewing time is a massive signal about what truly grabs you.
So this is how it all adds up. Every one of these tiny little actions, every click, every pause, every second of viewing time, it all gets collected and stitched together. And with it, they build this incredibly detailed profile, not of who you say you are, but of how you actually behave.
And here's what's so wild. The system, it really doesn't care about your beliefs, or your identity, or the person you're trying to be. All it cares about is the cold, hard, measurable data of your raw, unfiltered actions. Who you think you are is irrelevant. How you actually behave is everything.
And why is that data so valuable? Well, it's because our behavior, when you look at enough of it, follows patterns. It can be modeled. And once you have a good model, you can predict what someone's going to do next with scary accuracy. And right here, this is the end game. This is the whole point. It's not just about predicting your next move. It's about influencing that move. It's about serving you the exact right ad or video or article at the exact right second to gently, or not so gently, nudge you in a certain direction.
So, how does it work? It's all based on this powerful nonstop feedback loop. First, the system watches you and learns from your data. Then it immediately adapts what it shows you based on that learning. As you react to the new stuff, it refines its model of you even further. And then, of course, it shows you more of what worked, which starts the whole cycle over again, getting smarter every time.
So when you boil it all down, this entire incredibly complex machine has one beautifully simple, relentless goal. Find out what keeps your eyes glued to the screen, and then give you an infinite supply of it. The whole point is to maximize your engagement, because more engagement means more data, and more data is more money.
Okay, so we've got the what and the how. We know our behavior is being tracked, predicted, and even steered. But that leaves us with one last massive question to think about. If our behavior is being guided, who exactly is at the controls?
All right, let's talk about something that affects every single one of us, the digital world we're all living in. We all kind of feel it, don't we? That sense that our online experience is ours, that it's been tailor-made just for us. But have you ever stopped and really wondered, who is this all built for? Is it actually for you? You know the feeling, right? Over time, your feeds, your recommendations, all of it just starts to feel really familiar. Your digital environment becomes, well, perfectly personalized. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This personalization, this whole custom-built world around you, it isn't necessarily designed for your benefit or for your growth. It's designed for one thing: optimization. You see, the system isn't trying to make you happier or smarter. It's just trying to get better at predicting your next click. And here's the crucial point. It's not the content that's being optimized. It's you.
So let's start by digging into what this actually looks and feels like from the inside. This cozy, comfortable world that gets built, piece by piece, right around you. The logic behind this whole thing is, well, it's brutally efficient. The system shows you things, and whenever you respond, with a click, a like, even just pausing for a second longer, it takes note and shows you more of that. But just as important is what you don't see. You start seeing less and less of anything you ignore. It's this constant, fundamental trade-off that's always happening in the background.
Okay, so how does this machine actually run? Let's pop the hood and take a look at the engine behind it all. The logic of optimization.
It's all just one big feedback loop, and it always starts with you. First, you engage with something. Then the system learns from every single one of those interactions. Based on what it learns, it reinforces what it thinks you want by feeding you more of the same. And the end result of this cycle? Your world gets smaller. Your digital reality literally becomes a mirror, just reflecting your own past behavior back at you. So your reality becomes filtered, then narrowed, and then reinforced. Over and over. Each loop just locks you in a little tighter. So where does all this lead? What's the ultimate consequence of this whole process? Well, you end up living inside something the source material calls the version. And when you're inside it, wow, it's seductive. Because everything just makes sense. Everything connects. It really starts to feel like you're seeing the whole, complete picture of the world.
But it isn't. That feeling of completeness, it's just an illusion.
So what exactly is the version? It's a reality that's been tailor-made from your own data, built entirely around your past behavior. It's designed specifically to feel whole, but in truth, it's just one tiny, highly filtered slice of the much, much larger world out there. And the longer you stay inside, the harder it is to even realize you're there. And why is that? Because everything feels consistent, everything feels familiar, and eventually, after a while, everything just feels true. It creates this powerful, self-validating worldview. So this brings us to a much deeper, more critical question that we really have to ask ourselves. I mean, think about it. If the information you consume every single day is being actively shaped and filtered just for you, what does that do to the way you actually think, to how you form your own opinions? And that leads to the final and maybe the most important question of all. In a system that's literally designed to guide your behavior, how much control do you really have? So what are we supposed to do? Well, the answer isn't to just delete all your accounts or go offline. It's something much more fundamental. This is where awareness becomes absolutely essential. Simply knowing that this process is happening, that you are living inside the version, that is the most powerful tool you have. It's the first step to being able to see beyond the filter. And that's the thought we want to leave you with. Because once you're aware of the filter, you can start to get curious about what's on the other side. So ask yourself, what exists beyond my filter?